They say the city forgives almost everything, so long as the light keeps catching the right surfaces. I believed that once. Believed the polished faces of buildings could glint a story until its edges were invisible. He touched me like no one else ever had. Not with the intimacy of a hand brushing hair. Not with a lover's claim. But with influence. With possession braided into the small mercies of protection. The touch was a key pressed into my palm, literal and not, and it asked a question I would spend months learning how to answer. Creative license. Minor scene details and dialogue are fictionalized for narrative coherence. It was raining the night he found me at the curb, the city making itself slippery and ornate. My umbrella had been mercifully small. One of those black, cheap things I always regretted when the light was right. But Dante Moretti's was wide and glossy, an umbrella that expected to be seen. He regarded me as if I were both spectacle and ledger, a thing whose value could be measured, recorded, balanced. "You look wet," he said, which is not a sentence you expect to change the direction of your life, until it does. In his hand, he held a business card printed in a typeface that belonged to bank vaults and private clubs. There was a key attached to the card by a thin silver ring, a house key, the kind that still makes a serious sound when it hits a table. The metal came cool through the leather of my glove and left a faint thumbprint memory on my skin. He did not make a show of it. The offer was spoken the way one hands over a coat, an assumption of warmth, not an imposition. "There's room at my house, for a week, if you want shelter." It was not phrased as charity, it was phrased as logistics, as a problem solved. That was the shape of his touch, practicality wrapped in generosity. I said yes. I have been told since that the simplest acts of saying yes can be misconstrued as invitations to ownership. They are right. Consent, I would learn, is not a punctuation mark at a single moment, but a practice you must continuously perform, an ongoing inventory of choices. That night, holding the key, I felt neither owned nor freed. I felt instead like a woman who had traded one type of loneliness for another, equally furnished. Rosa met me at the door the following evening. Rosa, who moves as if she were always balancing a tray and choosing which things to save. She is a small moral compass in a household built for excess. House manager by title, steward by temperament. Her uniform is always unspeaking. Her reprimands are measured with lemon oil and a towel. She greeted me with the same composure she showed the staff. A bright, unstartled face that had seen the world folded and ironed into shape and decided how to keep its seams intact. "Welcome," she said, and the voice made no attempt to be warm or cold. It was simply accurate. Rosa escorted me through rooms that smelled of lemon oil, of old books and new varnish. Tulips in a blue glass vase leaned like citizens in an audience. Cameras pointed at edges and corners, small black pinpricks that recorded more than they kept. Each lens carried a tiny label, a placard that read, plainly, Entry Hall Cam 1, Terrace Cam 2, Garden Greenhouse Cam. The labels were small but deliberate, like the punctuation of an ethics lesson. Transparency had a sound there, the soft, steady hum of the house's heart, a machine of light and record-keeping. Marco, the driver, was waiting in the garage. His hands were as competent as the car he maintained. He had the spare, reserved face of someone whose skill lay in preventing things from going wrong until the moment they did. He bowed once, a small chromatic gesture of a professional introduced to a new variable. Marco wore a plain jacket and carried the sort of silence that is not absence, but readiness. He addressed me by name exactly once, and then only to say, "We run a perimeter. Cameras are live. You'll have a consent form." Marco folded his hands and returned to his duty. The analyst arrived the next morning. A woman with a phone that loved numbers and a cardigan that loved order. She walked the house with a practiced eye and muttered into an app. She was the kind of person to whom logs spoke as clearly as weather spoke to sailors. She explained the recording protocol as if reciting a recipe. Video feeds backed up off-site, motion sensors calibrated, timestamps synchronized to a national clock. Her thoroughness felt like a kind of faith. As she closed her tablet, she met my eyes for a heartbeat and said, "If you want anything pulled from history, I can trace it." We signed a consent agreement that afternoon. It was short and dense, a document that set the house's terms. Visible cameras, staff disclosures, a requirement that any use of private force be logged and auditable. There were lines for emergency protocols, for rights to withdraw shelter, for processes by which the house's records could be handed over to a prosecutor. I read it twice. I signed it once. In the center of the paper, someone had drawn a tiny emblem of a key. Dante walked me through the clauses with a certain patient civility, the kind of calm that hid a muscle ready to tense. He emphasized detectable things. No shrouded rooms, no unlogged payments, no loose ends. He spoke as one negotiates the placement of mirrors. How much exposure is acceptable? How much privacy remains intact? "You're serious about the logs," I said, holding the pen over the signature line. "About their being available." He nodded. "With oversight. No private erasures." There was a small, meaningful silence then. The sentence between agreement and action, the fraction of a second when consent is most honest. I placed the key that night in a small leather jewelry box I keep on a dressing table. It sat among cufflinks and a watch that had stopped once but been repaired for appearance's sake. The key, heavier than it looked, felt like a vote. I turned it over in my hands and found myself cataloging its ridges as if they were habits I might need to break. Obligations, assumptions, the kinds of favors that accrue interest. For a week I lived as if on display, and as if in sovereign quiet at once. The house operates like a careful instrument, meals timed, mornings arranged, cameras unblinking yet unobtrusive, as if the presence of being watched altered one's moral geometry. I kept the key in my jewelry box, returning to it like one might return to an old refrain. I tested the practice of saying no where it mattered. Declining drinks, declining soirees laid on in the name of charity, declining photographs that felt like claims. Each no made the key lighter. Dante's touch is less about the skin than about the architecture of influence. He is a man of small gestures that carry heavy weight. A donation wired the day before a city council vote, an op-ed placed at just the right time, an ally turned quiet and persuasive in a boardroom. He has a way of making institutions lean politely toward his will. Where others see power as a blunt object, he treats it as currency, as ledger entries. Ledger. It is a word I return to often. I had learned to keep ledgers of my own. Appointments, loves, the names of those I owed calls to. But Dante kept a ledger with the tenderness others reserve for a child's face. He kept names and numbers, evenings and payments, a tabulated moral arithmetic meant to preserve what he called order. He called it order without a hint of irony, as if that word could sanctify means. 2 nights into my stay, in the greenhouse where the heat made the tulips sweat, he brought up the ledger in tones that ceased to be casual. "I keep a record," he said. The sentence was the slow opening of a long door. Sometimes the state is too slow. Sometimes families need quicker answers. I have paid for those quicker answers. There is no tasteful way to say the things he admitted next. He told not of fantasies but of mechanics. Contractors who intimidated, payments that ensured silence, the occasional extraction. People moved out of certain neighborhoods, files dissociated from certain agencies, men who found themselves elsewhere. He spoke in clauses and logistics, as if detaching human consequence from method could make it lighter, more administrative. He also admitted that his methods had occasionally gone further than intended. Sometimes intimidation had tipped into disappearance. Sometimes quiet pressure had bled into irreparable harm. "I thought I was preventing worse things," he said, a small flat note of self-defense. His hands were on a bench, and the greenhouse light made little stars on the veins of his fingers. "I thought I was buying time." I asked him, plainly, if he had ever ordered harm that could not be undone. The admission that followed is one that the House would receive, and the analyst would record. It is an admission I will not attempt to render in quotation, as if it were a verbatim confession. He confessed to having used extrajudicial means, hush money, paid contractors, measures taken beyond the law's edge. He admitted to being willing to cross lines he could justify in private. He did not aim to murder the idea that he had done wrong. He aimed to contextualize it. That is important because context can be used as defense as easily as it can be used as explanation. He told me things the record would later echo. The ledger exists. There are names and amounts. There are dates and phone numbers and instructions. The analyst made notes with a steady hand, and, at my request, began to export certain feeds to an off-site backup. I asked for the ledger to be turned over to the proper authorities. I made that request in the house's kitchen, the kettle shrieking its domestic alarm in the background. I did not say this to be dramatic. I said it because my idea of shelter included auditability, and because the price of staying in Dante's house was not complicity in his private empire. He hesitated in a way that is, in retrospect, a sort of signature. Hesitation by Dante is not a stutter. It is the slow assessment of risk versus attachment. He had, he said, options: to manage things quietly, to pay, to relocate. Then he said he would comply. Not to be saved, but because he recognized the cost of secrecy. He offered the ledger and promised to submit it under counsel to a district attorney. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that what he had been protecting with his own hands required a different form of stewardship. There is a moral friction in the idea of handing private power over to public institutions. We trust institutions because, ideally, their remit reaches beyond a single man's preference. We distrust them because they move slowly and are susceptible to the same politics that create the need for private interventions in the first place. I insisted on transparency, not merely the production of a ledger but the presence of auditors, of independent counsel, of a plan that prioritized survivors. I insisted that any restitution framework be survivor-centered, that funds be allocated for counseling, relocation, and legal support, rather than simply to public relations cleanups. Dante agreed, and when he agreed he did so with the kind of performative solemnity that had accompanied many of his earlier gestures. He signed a preliminary letter of intent to provide the records and to fund a foundation that would be overseen by an independent board. The word fund became a talisman. Money, he hoped, could convert a private ledger into public repair. Here is where the ledger becomes less metaphor and more instrument. In one of the house's study drawers, Dante kept a slim volume, a real ledger of paper and ink, edges stained with coffee, an analog thing in a world that favors digital shadows. He slid it across the desk. The paper gave a dry, private sound when opened. The ledger's pages were meticulous in a way that said the person who kept them feared chaos. There were names, dates, terse descriptions, entries of sums, and the purposes of those sums. They read like someone trying to clean a room by listing every object. I did not read everything at once. There were names I recognized and others I did not. There were notations that hinted at favors extended and favors extracted. I asked for a subset to be copied and sent to an independent analyst. The analyst complied, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone stewarding truth. We made backups. We notarized copies. We arranged for a meeting with the DA. We drafted letters that insisted on survivor-centered processes. When the decision to involve the DA was taken, it altered the geometry of the house. The cameras, once domestic instruments, now felt like witnesses. Rosa moved with a new purpose. She cataloged receipts and messages with the fidelity of someone habituated to repair. Marco watched the perimeter with attention in his jaw, as if the muscles there would be the first to notice the change in air pressure. The analyst sent encrypted folders to a secure server. Each transfer left a digital breadcrumb. I slept in the room with the view. The window that looked onto the terrace where the lamps blurred into rainlight. I dreamed in ledgers, rows and columns of people whose names had become accounting. When I woke, I would trace the key on the palm of my hand and wonder what I had allowed my life to become. A ledger entry in someone else's book, or a person insisting on ownership of her own days. There were tests soon enough. Small things at first. A van idling too long a block away. A folded paper tucked beneath a fence with a photograph. The simple machinations of intimidation. Calibracy. Spelled by those in investigations as if a company and a conspiracy had blended into one, was patient and strategic. It sent signals that said, perimeter challenged. We are attentive. The house responded as a living organism. Guards rearranged their shifts, motion sensors were tightened. A new camera pointed toward the street. Marco began to patrol in patterns that altered the footfall of the house. I learned his steps like new music. One morning a package arrived on the terrace, a brown envelope with no return address. Inside was a single line of text and a single image. A photograph of Marco taken from a distance, the image grainy. A timestamp that suggested hours he had not advertised. The photograph read like an accusation. We know your guard. We can reach him. It was the sort of message that folds the world smaller. Dante read the photograph and did not flinch so much as settle into a different mode of calculation. He moved to the desk and called a name I had heard before. A contractor who handled security audits, someone with connections that could either reassure or provoke. He started listing options aloud, some of which were pragmatic, and some of which walked dangerously close to the ledgered methods he claimed he wanted to stop. I interrupted him. "We don't answer intimidation with extra-legal measures," I said. The sentence was deliberately straightforward. I wanted it to land without melodrama. He turned and listened. "I know," he said. His voice had that habitual, measured quality, but there was an underlayer of something. Concern, perhaps, or attachment. "We will do the procedural thing." I believe he meant the words. Belief is a strange currency. It is measured more by action than utterance, and action is where the house's story would be decided. We began to draft 2 parallel tracks. One focused on legal transparency, sharing anonymized ledger elements with the DA, flagging names that implicated contractor networks like Calibracy, and another focused on foundation building, setting up a board with independent members, routing funds that could be used for restitution and survivor services. Rosa compiled a list of survivors the foundation could reach out to. The analyst cross-checked entries for duplications or redactions that might have been made to conceal the worst acts. The ledger became an engine. It threatened what once had been private and promised what might be public. Marco, for his part, grew quieter. He drove our car with a concentration that suggested preoccupation. Sometimes, when the house slept, I would hear the soft click of his boots on the terrace and the faint murmur of his radio. Once, I caught him staring at the key in my jewelry box, and I saw, in that attentiveness, not covetousness, but the burden of someone deciding whether to act in a way that might ruin him. He had his own ledger, debts, obligations that owed him more than gratitude. He carried them like stones. There is a point at which disclosure ceases to be moral theater and starts to be practical intervention. We set a date to meet with the DA, a place where the ledger's paper could begin to be translated into a functioning investigation. The DA's office is a room that looks like a nursery for lawsuits, long tables, overstuffed folders, a kind of official tiredness that is not dramatic but steady. I had imagined I would be anxious. Instead, I felt a resolute kind of clarity. I had chosen to turn private power into evidence and to ask the state to do what it had been created to do. Dante came with a small delegation, his counsel, a sober-looking partner, and a man who kept a ledger of his own, a fixer, who seemed to know the rhythm of disclosures. He placed an envelope on the table and folded his hands. "I am handing over what I have," he said. He said it not as surrender, but as an act of inventory, which is still not forgiveness, but is, perhaps, the first practical step toward accountability. We began the process, the DA's team taking copies, the analyst overseeing the file transfers. They asked questions we could not answer without more time. They requested subpoenas, time-stamped logs, authentication of handwriting. The ledger was only the beginning. If you have ever watched an institution unspool a private ledger, you will notice how methodical it is, slow, deliberate, precise. It lacks the theatricality of vigilante justice, but holds a different promise: legitimacy. There are, of course, problems. The DA spoke of statutes, of limits to what could be proven without witnesses, of chains of custody. He did not make grand promises. He spoke like a man whose currency was caution. Marco's photograph, the envelopes, the digital breadcrumbs, they had their uses, but proving coercion, proving intent, proving culpability beyond reasonable doubt, this is a mountainous path. We met those realities with paperwork and witness lists. After the meeting, Dante walked me to the car. Rain had resumed in earnest, a soft, consistent wash that made the streetlights smear like wax. He handed me a second key, smaller, a different cut. A key to the foundation's safety deposit box where, he said, initial funds would be kept until the board convened. The second key felt less like ownership and more like custody. I slid it into my bag. It felt, in that moment, like a promise I might spend a lifetime weighing. "You could leave," he said quietly, as if offering escape. "No one would stop you." I looked at him in the intermission between rain and sound. There was something genuine in the offer of absence. Perhaps that was his native generosity. But I remembered the key in my jewelry box and the signature at the bottom of the consent form. I also remembered the photograph tucked against the fence and the faces of those listed in the ledger. "I'm staying," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "Not for you. For the ledger." He smiled then, and it was a small, complicated thing. It was the expression of a man who had been touched by attachment and had allowed that attachment to open a wound he could not close with money alone. His greatest sin, if one must name it, was not that he had helped or even harmed. It was that he had believed his influence could substitute for public, accountable systems. The key in my pocket proved to be the instrument of that detachment and also, oddly, the instrument of possible repair. We had not yet decided exactly what model the foundation would take, who would sit on the board, or how restitution would be prioritized. These were technical questions that would take months of negotiation. But the act of opening the ledger's pages to an external hand had changed the moral geometry of the house. It was no longer merely a place of private favors. It had become a site of transition. That I stayed was not a surrender. It was a civic decision in miniature. I wanted to test whether attachment could be reframed into accountability. Attachment had led him to harm. Perhaps attachment could lead him to allow harm to be repaired. In the days that followed, the house recalibrated. Meetings multiplied like shadows thrown by a lamp. Contractors were dismissed. New security protocols were drafted. Rosa insisted on a survivor's first clause in the foundation charter, shooting down suggestions that funds be used to wash reputations. Marco enrolled in training programs. He began to teach a younger guard how to log incidents properly. The analyst became a liaison for encrypted evidence, her work technical but unwavering. Each small bureaucratic reform felt, oddly, like prayer, an attempt to make something sacred of the everyday. There were night calls. Someone left a recording on the house phone, an anonymous voice that breathed threats, the kind designed to unsettle. Another morning, a drone hummed too close to a terrace light, and then rewound, as if testing response times. Calabresi pushed at the seam of our arrangement, choosing the slowest kind of erosion. Pressure, not crash. We documented everything. The cameras did their slow truth-telling, but documentation is not proof unless respected by institutions. We learned to create redundancies, backups on different servers, chain of custody forms, time-stamped witnesses. The rituals felt tedious and holy in equal measure. They were ways to translate private acts into public records, and all the while Dante's touch remained present. He would enter a room and adjust a lamp, place his hand on a widow's shoulder, and say something practical about insurance. He would recommend a counsel, offer tactical asset transfers to make restitution possible. His presence was at once helpful and problematic, like administering a vaccine with a syringe stolen from a morgue. It is messy to try to convert the mechanisms of possession into instruments of repair. One afternoon, Rosa found a ledger entry that made her leave a book of receipts open on the mantel and not close it. It was not the most incriminating line, the kind that makes the press howl, but it was personal in a way that unsettled the household. It named a woman who had been relocated and given a stipend without counsel. Rosa, who takes care in seeing people as people rather than numbers, demanded that the foundation reach out and offer real support, not just stipends. She wanted counseling, housing assistance, a named advocate. She wanted listening. We began to shape the charter accordingly. The board would include independent advocates, survivors, and people with no ties to Dante's professional network. Funds would be dispersed through transparent criteria, not private discretion. Keys to the safety deposit box would require multiple signatures. The ledger itself would be digitized and redacted where necessary to protect victims, but not so sanitized as to be useless. Late one night, alone in the study, I opened the leather jewelry box and took out the two keys. The older one, simple, heavy, felt like past behavior. The newer one, small, clean-cut, felt like an instrument of intent. I lined them up on the desk like two statements. Keys, I thought, are never merely about doors. They are about the choice to lock or to open. If the history of the house showed one thing, it was that power is a form of closeness. When someone is close to you, even rightly, there is a temptation to act privately in ways that would be unthinkable publicly. Dante had been close enough to believe he could manage risk alone. His greatest sin had been that he allowed attachment to blur the boundary between protection and erasure. The ledger, when finally revealed, would reveal that sin in ink and sums. Yet there was hope threaded through the same ledger. There were entries that suggested attempts at restitution, funds set aside for relocation, payments for schooling, notes about housing matched to counseling sessions. They were messy, small, imperfect attempts to convert personal power into structural repair. It would be the work of many people to make those attempts meaningful. There is a peculiar loneliness in being the person who insists on auditability. Friends drift away because it is awkward to sit at a table where receipts and ethics are discussed. Strangers appear because the story is saleable. I learned to accept both: the solitude of integrity and the publicity of action. I had chosen a difficult sort of life, the life of someone who will not allow tidy narratives when complexity is owed to the facts. When I walked the hall that night, the house felt less like an instrument and more like an experiment. An experiment in how to hold someone accountable without dissolving every human tie. An experiment in how to harness influence so it funds repair instead of erasure. The keys in my pocket were not proof of virtue, they were tokens of responsibility. The call came 2 days after I placed the ledger copies in the DA's hands. It came to Marco on his radio and then into the house like a ripple. The voice was clipped, a perimeter test becoming a perimeter breach. A van had been spotted, its plates obscured, moving in an odd loop around the neighborhood. Then, an hour later, a photograph. Men in masks, a vehicle idling close to the house. Calabresi had not been silent. It had been testing. We prepared as best we could. Checklists, additional camera feeds, a brief rearrangement of shifts. Marco's shoulders tightened, and his hands found the same steady pace. Rosa insisted the garden shutters close early. The analyst triple-checked the backups. We were not naive. We knew tests could be probes toward more violent ends. We were also not inclined to answer with the methods Dante had once used. When the van pulled up that evening, it did so with the calm deliberation of violence that had been planned. The streetlights made the van's paint look like wet iron. I stood in the foyer with a cup of tea gone cold, because the house is a place that teaches you to keep small domestic rituals, even when your world is rearranging itself. Marco moved before anyone gave permission. He is trained for this. Men spilled from the van. There was yelping, shouting, the electric teeth of flashlights carving faces into night. I will not dramatize the shooting beyond what it was. An event of consequence, an act with human cost. Marco fired. A man collapsed. The sounds the city makes after violence are ordinary. Sirens that grow and recede. The whisper of neighbors at curtains. The unblinking cameras catching every angle. Someone shouted for the ambulance. Someone else shouted to preserve the scene. Later, as in the long after that stretches for weeks, we would learn names and pieces and legal procedures. The DA would open a file, forensic teams would sift through footage, and narratives would begin to compete for public oxygen. For now, standing in a kitchen I had imagined to be a place of safe commerce, I held the key in my hand and felt the weight of choices that had led us to this moment. There is no glory in such days. There is only the grim, patient work of accounting and care. We wrapped the immediate, the wounds, the forms, and waited for the state to do what it must do. Investigate, decide, and proceed with whatever combination of mercy and chastisement it deemed fit. I could not pretend the house had been a perfect shield. I also could not pretend that I had been naive about the risks of transparency. We had chosen method over secrecy, and method has its own dangers. When the first reporters arrived, they asked the easy questions: who had the keys, who paid for what, who was responsible. The house slid into the machinery of public narrative with a reluctance that could be felt like gravity. The ledger leaked into headlines like a slow bloom, and with it the debate about whether personal influence could ever be legitimate if wielded without consent. People began to speak in absolutes, which is always the lazy religion of public discourse. I watched them from the terrace window and pressed the key into my palm until the metal printed a map into my skin. The foundation was still only a plan then. Draft charters, a proposed board, donor lists with names both expected and reluctant. Dante spoke of it as if a new institution could be born from the ashes of what he had done. I listened and insisted on conditions: transparency, survivor representation, multiple keys to the safety deposit box. The analyst worked to redact names of those who needed protection. Rosa drew up lists of local councilors. There is a thing that happens when you begin to turn private power into public accountability. You discover how much repair is not about money. It is about time, advocacy, relentless listening. It is about the painstaking logistics of ensuring someone has a roof and legal counsel, and a voice in the little meetings where decisions are made about them. Money is necessary but insufficient. I kept the keys in my bag the night I walked out into the city and into the rain. Light glinted off wet pavement and made bright stitches in the dark. The key was a small metallic argument in my hand. Was I custody holder now, or gatekeeper? The ledger had been opened and the first steps toward forming a foundation had been taken. But the path ahead was not preordained. There would be hearings. There would be negotiations. There would be, likely, the slow discomfort of compromises, plea deals, undisclosed settlements, bargains with imperfect institutions. What mattered to me was that the ledger had been exposed to scrutiny and that survivors were invited into the conversation, not merely spoken for. I could feel Dante's attention like pressure on the back of my neck. He had been touched by attachment in a way that did not let him go. That attachment had produced harm when untempered, and it produced perhaps the willingness to begin repair. Whether repair would be adequate was another question. Whether the man who had believed influence could be a substitute for law would accept constraint was another. The week I had accepted the key was now several weeks behind me. The house had been transformed into a site of process, a place where the material facts of power could be inspected. Marco had been present for more than his role required. He had been a witness to choices that would complicate his life in the weeks to come. Rosa had become, in all but title, a guardian for the ledger's human subjects. The analyst had become the quiet hand that ensured evidence wasn't lost. I slept poorly that night, and when morning came I found the keys missing from my jewelry box. I looked and looked, heart doing a small, familiar double beat. Finally I found them in the left pocket of my coat, as if I had carried the responsibility outward and not inward. The keys felt like a punctuation mark. They are devices by which doors open and close, and my life had become a string of decisions about which doors to secure and which to unlock. There is more to tell, about subpoenas and testimony, about the formation of the foundation and the meetings that will determine how money is spent, about Marco's choices under the law, about the way Calibracy continues to test perimeters. There is more to tell about the slow work of translating private remorse into public accountabilities. For now, I walked into the rain with the heavier key in my pocket, and the new key laid against the ledger on my desk. They felt together, like a promise yet unproven, that influence might be converted into instruments of repair, and that the cost of misuse would be recorded and perhaps redressed. The city kept forgiving. The light kept catching the right surfaces, but the ledger kept its silent rose, and I kept my hands on the keys. If this is the sort of story you come for, character-driven moral suspense, where the language is careful and the stakes are intimate, consider subscribing. There are more chapters to walk through: the legal unspooling, the pressure of public narrative, and the quiet, stubborn work of trying to do restitution rightly. When I returned to the house, the gardener had pushed back the wet leaves from the terrace, and Rosa had placed a clean cup on the counter. The analyst had printed a new list. Dante was in the study, elbows on the desk, hands splayed over the open ledger in a posture that could be interpreted as contrition or calculation. Often, it is both. He looked up when I came in. "They say you should let things rest for a few days," he said, but neither of us believed that rhetoric. "No," I said. "They say a lot of things." I set the new key on the table between us, placed it down like evidence, like invitation. He reached, and his fingers closed around the key as if it were a small animal that might bolt. For a moment the room looked like a ledger page, 2 columns, inked and finite. His hand covered the metal and a little map of his life folded in the skin between us. He did not try to take it back. Instead, he shrugged, an admission thin as paper. "That will be useful," he said. The sentence was both factual and flawed by affection. I left the key on the table and sat down opposite him. The ledger lay open, a whisper of coffee and graphite. Outside, the rain had gone from polite to insistent, turning the terrace lights into streaks like writing in a hurry. We did not speak for a long time. The house, lately an instrument, seemed to be listening. What followed was the kind of slow, procedural intimacy that is the actual work of accountability. There were meetings that tasted like boiled sugar, necessary and without much joy. The DA's office requested authentication, chain of custody forms. They demanded witnesses be prepared. The analyst ran tests on file hashes and incorporated metadata into a sealed package. Rosa walked into rooms and announced who would be present like a small court, careful to name people by their dignity rather than their function. Marco drove, sat at counsel's request, and kept his head down as if concentration could reshape the past. We convened the first board meeting for the foundation in an austere conference room that smelled faintly of lemon oil from a cleaner someone had considered charitable. The list of invited members read like a compromise between necessity and idealism. Independent advocates, a lawyer from a survivors' rights group, an academic who studied restorative justice, a woman who had been resettled by a community program years earlier, and who agreed to sit if her name were not used publicly. Dante proposed several names from his circle, people he trusted to steward money. Rosa vetoed several of them with the gentle firmness of an altar server refusing gilding. I insisted, loudly enough to be noticed, that survivors had to be centered in the governance structure, not guests at the table. We argued, we drafted bylaws, we wrote down processes for disbursement of funds and redaction protocols for the public ledger. I held the small key in my palm between discussions, turning it the way one turns a thought that will not resolve. The key was no longer a token of private warmth. It had been recast as a requirement, a custody tool with signatures and witnesses, with 3 keys required before the safety deposit box could be opened. Dante signed. Rosa watched him sign as if she were cataloging his pattern. As the foundation took shape, the DA's office moved with professional impatience. Subpoenas were issued. We supplied copies of records, authenticated handwriting samples, and provided witness lists. The analyst escorted evidence like a librarian shepherding rare books. Careful, exacting, unromantic. The investigation itself felt less cinematic than relentless. Phone records matched to dates, bank transfers tied to names, photographs compared to entries in the paper ledger. The institution's machinery is not graceful, but it is consistent. It produces slowly the sort of truth that survives headlines. Calibracy did not applaud. The network probed in quiet ways meant to unsettle. A hand-lettered note slipped under Rosa's door, vandalism at an advisor's home, a threatening voicemail to an analyst's personal number. Once, an envelope arrived containing a list of donors and the annotation, "We could close their accounts." Another time someone left a map with certain streets circled. These were not spectacular tactics. They were the daily weather of pressure. We redoubled our safeguards. The analyst arranged alternate travel routes for vulnerable witnesses. Rosa authorized emergency funds for anyone experiencing intimidation. We contracted outside security audits and instituted a survivor hotline placed under the foundation's name, managed by professionals with no tie to Dante. This last measure felt to me essential. It signaled that the people harmed in the ledger would not be left to the mercy of a man's conscience. The press, sensing drama, pushed at seams. Journalists called with tones that wanted a confession and a villain. Others wanted nuance. Some sought the romance of a scandal, the shock value of the title that would write itself independent of our choices. I declined interviews that would make the ledger into a spectacle. I agreed to sit with reporters who wished to focus on process and repair. Dante issued a statement drafted by counsel and approved by the DA's liaison. Not contrition spelled as absolution, but a pledge to cooperate. The language was careful and public-facing. It was not the same thing as the private admissions he had made in the greenhouse, but it was a necessary bridge between confession and procedure. Marco's life after the shooting unfolded in the small, cruel increments of legal process. He was not, in my estimation, a man built for headlines. He had a ledger of his own. Family obligations, debts, a past that had required muscle rather than speech. The DA approached him with options: cooperate in exchange for consideration, face prosecution for use of force if not justified. He agreed to an interview under counsel and, later, to a plea arrangement that would be negotiated behind closed doors. I am not at liberty to offer the particulars of that negotiation. The law demands discretion, and many terms remain sealed or provisional. Indefinido. Specific plea terms and sentencing outcomes are not detailed here as they extend beyond the available record. What I can say is this: Marco chose cooperation. It was a choice that cost him dignity, and perhaps a measure of his future freedom. In return, his testimony, his calibration of events, his willingness to describe exactly how the van moved and where the flashes came from provided the DA with the kinds of specifics that paper ledgers and bank transfers could not. He gave an account of the noise, the timestamps, the angle from which the assailant had fired. He read aloud under subpoena the rhythm of his responses, the training he'd been given, the split-second calculus. His voice trembled once in the courthouse, then it steadied. He understood that the best path to accountability might run through his own admission of fault, and the documentation of the network that had targeted them. Dante, in turn, did not attempt to rewrite his past in public with theatrical admissions. He negotiated with counsel and engaged with the DA. He delivered additional records when asked. He sat for hours with analysts authenticating entries, confirming the chain of custody for files previously thought to be private. He withdrew some of his initial suggestions for management and accepted, with an air of formalism, a more distributed governance model for the foundation. These were not acts of repentance in the sentimental sense. They were corrections of method, an attempt to convert private means into public process. Outside the formalities, there were human acts of repair that money and policy could not immediately accomplish. Rosa organized home visits, not to peddle comfort, but to listen. She would sit in impersonal kitchens with a weary steadiness and ask the questions that had eluded bureaucrats. What do you need to sleep tonight? Who did you lose trust in? The answers were small, granular. A bus pass, a call to a landlord, a pediatrician's number. The foundation's initial disbursements were allocated half to immediate material needs and half to medium-term legal support. We set up a survivor advisory council. Private meetings where members decided how funds should be used and which legal defenses needed prioritizing. Some survivors wanted complete public exposure of the ledger. Others wanted redaction and privacy. We learned, almost immediately, that consent extends into the repair process as insistently as it informs shelter. There were moments when the old habits of influence tried soft ways of returning. An acquaintance of Dante's, one of those polite lobbyists who attends civic dinners and leaves with favors in their pocket, suggested a PR campaign to showcase the foundation's work in the press. Rosa cut through it with a look that left the man apologizing and deflated. "This is not a photo op," she said, and the sentence had the weight of both admonition and defense. "It is support for people who have had their lives rearranged." Her words felt like a ledger line penned in the margin. Do not let optics substitute for justice. There were legal binders whose weight seemed designed to intimidate. Pages and pages of redacted names and receipts. We filed motions and responded to discovery requests. The DA's office pushed for witnesses to be prepared. Defense counsel argued about admissibility and hearsay. I sat through depositions and hearings because this was where the abstract ledger encountered the law. Sometimes the law moved with the grand slowness of glaciers. Sometimes, when a piece of evidence was damning and clear, it hastened like a river after thaw. It was never a single arc of triumph or failure. Meanwhile, Calabresi continued to nudge and bruise. There were 2 nights of vandalism against an advisor not directly tied to Dante, but who had given a statement supporting the Foundation's survivor-centered approach. Graffiti appeared on a car. A window was cracked. The acts were intended to erode willpower without creating martyrs. They were, in their way, proof that private networks could punish dissent quietly. In one such moment, the analyst received an anonymous email containing a file with a corrupted hash and an offer. Stop the investigation, and we will return the original content intact. The sender assumed that technical expertise could be bought. The analyst forwarded the message to the DA and an outside cyber forensics team arranged by counsel. It was a small demonstration of why transparency had to be defended by more than trust. We learned, painfully, that the ledger's survival required protocols, and that the temptation to erase truth does not belong to any one man. It belongs to systems that prefer tidy endings. There was also the slow, intimate work of truth-telling with people who had been named in the ledger. We offered outreach that respected privacy and agency, not press releases, but labeled envelopes, counselor-presenced conversations, assistance with relocation when desired. Some recipients were skeptical, some were relieved. One woman, whom I will not name, came to Rosa's kitchen and sat at the small table like a person tucking herself into a necessary conversation. She placed her hands around a cup of tea Dante's household had not yet learned to make well enough to be comforting, and she said simply, "I do not want his money. I want someone who says it was wrong." Her demand was not rhetorical. It was the kind of request that reoriented our priorities. We shifted funds to provide long-term counseling instead of immediate but hollow payments. We set up legal clinics to help people review settlement agreements and understand the implications of confidentiality clauses. There were setbacks. When we issued a preliminary grant for relocation, one recipient reported the funds had been misapplied by an intermediary. We had to claw back, apologize, and institute dual accounting to prevent future errors. The public sees gestures. The work is often a record of corrections. We learned to make room for that, to admit mistakes and to adjust governance accordingly. It felt, in everyday terms, like turning the house's culture from a seal-hold to a system of checks and balances. Dante's personal recalibration progressed unevenly. He attended some board meetings and left others to his counsel. He delegated his involvement where it might create distance between his influence and the Foundation's decisions. He accepted, with visible discomfort, the idea of multi-signature authorizations for funds he had originally believed only he could direct. He struggled with being a donor without direct oversight. The attachment that had once allowed him to substitute influence for process now reintroduced itself as a new tendency. The desire to be thought useful rather than beholden. We had to constrain that impulse with governance. In quieter moments, he showed a certain kind of tiredness that felt not self-punishing but sober. One evening, after a long, unedifying news cycle, he invited Rosa, the analyst, and me to the greenhouse to look at the plants. "They are resilient," he said, stroking a fern as if comfort could be borrowed from chlorophyll. He had a habit of using practical images to speak of moral things, and sometimes the metaphor landed. Sometimes it felt like gloss. We spoke about obligations and limits. He asked technical questions about how funds could be protected from predatory interests. He never suggested some grand restitution that would close all wounds, only smaller, bureaucratic fixes that might make survival easier. Publicly, the ledger leaked into commentary about the limits of private power. Opinion pieces debated whether men like Dante were benevolent aristocrats or dangerous men with too much discretion. Some pundits suggested that a bold man could, by force or leverage, solve problems faster than a sluggish state. Others argued that his very model undercut rule of law. Arguments shuttled between moral philosophy and municipal policy, which is often how a scandal becomes a civics lesson. We continued to resist turning people into symbols. I refused to sign anything that would turn survivors into footnotes. Rosa insisted on a clause that survivors could veto any public release of their names. The analyst insisted on secure, tiered access to records. The DA described, in cautious language, the tightrope of prosecuting actors embedded in complex networks, proving connection, proving specific intent. The law required more than ledger entries. It required witnesses, corroboration, and sometimes, proof of effect. We did what we could within those constraints. We supplied the facts, we provided context, we financed support for those who would be called to testify. There were nights when the house felt like a brittle cathedral, beautiful, built of careful things, and liable to collapse if not tended. I found myself pacing less and shepherding more. I spent hours negotiating where money should be directed and how policies should read. I learned to appreciate menial acts of governance. The way a receipt was filed, a signer's name checked twice, a bank transfer routed through a protected conduit. These were not glamorous. They were crucial. Then came the day the DA called with a new request. They needed Marco to testify in an evidentiary hearing concerning the van and the assailants' movements. Marco was frightened, understandably so. To return to a courthouse was to reopen a night he wished never to relive. He debated with counsel about the wisdom of cooperating at such public cost. In private, he told me that he feared being judged for firing, for killing someone, and that he feared his past would be played like a card against him. "You will be judged no matter what," I said. The sentence was brusque and perhaps unnecessarily flinty, but I meant to anchor him. You can choose to be honest, and to help make sure this network cannot do to others what it did to us. He looked at the key I carried in my pocket, at the newer, smaller key that opened the Foundation's deposit box. "It feels," he said slowly, "like I'm handing someone my life." "You already did," I told him. This is about what we build from it. He nodded. His testimony was difficult and precise. He described the pattern of the assault, the van's trajectory, the direction of muzzle flashes, the immediate decisions he had made. He described, with technical clarity, the sequence by which human fear turned into action. The DA's office cross-examined him about training and proportionality, about alternatives that might have been available. Defense counsel asked about motivations and whether Marco had been influenced by contact or orders. Marco answered with what he had: memory, time-stamped video, and a willingness to accept consequences. That willingness made him both vulnerable and useful. The DA used his testimony to corroborate digital evidence that, in combination, suggested coordinated aggression by operatives who had ties to networks like Calabrese. It did not, by itself, close every loophole. No single testimony does. But the mosaic grew more complete. There came a moment, months into the process, when I realized the house had changed shape in more than policy. The household learned to ask permission where it had once assumed assent. Meals were prepared with sensitivity to histories. Gifts of silence replaced ostentatious acts. The cameras remained, but their labels had shifted slightly. Where entry hall cam 1 once felt like surveillance, it began to feel like an insistence that acts be recordable, accountable. Rose's apron had more pocketed notes now. Names, resource phone numbers, survivor updates. Marco taught a class, in short bursts, to newer guards about chain of custody. How to write things down, how to record an incident so it could later be used in a court of law, instead of as a murmur in the dark. Dante, for his part, had moments of genuine recalibration. There was an afternoon in which he came to the small community center we had helped fund with a grant for legal aid. He stood awkwardly at the back as a woman we had assisted gave a brief testimony about how the relocation money had helped her find schooling for her children. He did not speak. He listened. When people afterwards thanked him, he deflected quietly, saying, "This is the work of many." It was an accurate description and perhaps a modest deflection. Whether he could bear being a donor without design remained a daily question. There were still threats. One night, an unmarked car circled the block 3 times after midnight. The analyst caught it on an external feed and forwarded the file to the DA's liaison. The police added patrols for a while. The car did not appear again. Calabrese's methods were slow and intended to erode resolve, and so there were long seasons of small, unnerving acts. We learned to treat them as they were. Not fatal errors in governance, but signals to be documented and routed to authorities. At the public board meeting that established the Foundation's charter, survivors sat at the table with legal counsel and asked the questions that mattered. One survivor demanded an explicit policy preventing confidentiality clauses that would shroud wrongdoing under legalese. Another asked for survivor-led audits. The board adopted several of these motions with votes that required multiple keys: the safety deposit box, the digital vault, and a set of escrow accounts, all requiring signatures from at least 3 independent members to be accessed. The keys were both symbolic and real. The safety deposit box key remained in my possession, the digital key under the analyst's custodianship, and a third key entrusted to an independent trustee unaffiliated with Dante. That night I slept in a bed that felt less like sanctuary and more like responsibility. The keys on my bedside table clinked, as if impatient. In the morning, I opened the ledger to review contributions and disbursements. The rows were messy. Notes about legal retainers, transfers to relocation accounts, payments for counseling. None of it was perfect, but the pattern showed movement from private exercise of power to institutionalized remediation. Months passed, and the public narrative shifted from scandal to policy debate. Legislators mentioned the ledger in committee hearings about private security contracting and the use of private surveillance. The Foundation testified in a closed hearing about the need for survivor-centered restitution frameworks. The argument about whether private men should be allowed to slip into public roles with secret ledgers became part of municipal ordinance discussions. What had begun on a rainy curb had bled, messy and unavoidable, into the structures of governance. We did not, in the end, create redemption out of a single ledger. No ledger can absolve a person of everything they have done. What we did do was to attempt to translate private errors into public responsibility, to insist that money be governed by criteria and that influence be checked by procedure. Some people praised the effort. Others called it insufficient. Both judgments struck me as true. Marco faced consequences. Dante faced reputational erosion and legal scrutiny. Survivors received assistance and, in some cases, legal closures. The foundation set up case management teams and a small justice fund. We hired counselors, set up job placement programs, and created a hotline staffed by people trained in trauma response. We created a small, independent audit committee that met quarterly and publicly released anonymized reports. The ledger remained, its pages partly redacted and partly digitized, an artifact and an instrument. I kept the keys. They were not trophies. They were a manifest reminder of a choice I had made. To stay, to insist on auditability, to try to turn influence into institutional repair rather than private erasure. There were times I regretted staying. Times when the temptation to leave for an easier life in a city with fewer reckonings tugged at me. But those days were balanced by small confirmations. A survivor who said, months later, that she felt heard. A hearing where evidence was used to subpoena records that had been hidden. Rosa who, once, hugged me in a way that required no explanation. He had touched me like no one else, not with a hand that declared ownership, but with an architecture of care that had blurred into possession. His greatest sin, as I saw it, was less an act than a habit. The belief that his will and his resources could substitute for systems designed to distribute responsibility. It was that belief which had allowed harm to accumulate in margins, and which now, when challenged, had required substantial structural repair. There is no tidy finality in a story like this. The foundation is young. Governance is imperfect. Some decisions will be second-guessed, and some funds misallocated despite our best efforts. Plea bargains will be struck in private, and will ask people to trade public airing for legal expedience. The DA will move where evidence compels him and where public interest demands it. But legal processes are slow and sometimes partial. Creative license. Specific legislative outcomes and sealed plea details are fictionalized or left indeterminate where not supported by source material. What exists, concretely, is this: a ledger that has been opened to authorized hands, a foundation governed by a board with survivor representation and independent oversight, a household that has restructured many of its internal practices to prioritize consent and auditability, a guard who chose to testify and will face consequences under the law while also aiding in the dismantling of a network that had targeted us, and a man, Dante, who has relinquished some unilateral control and allowed public process to begin. On an ordinary evening, months after the ambush, I walked from the house to the curb where the city's lights pooled like coins. It was raining, because the city has a way of making moments quieter with water, and I kept both keys in the pocket of my coat. A taxi idled. Someone shouted in the distance. The towels Rosa had placed in the foyer smelled faintly of lemon oil, as if the house had left its signature on me. I looked at the keys in the dim. They fit into the narrative of my life as instruments not of ownership, but of custody. One unlocked access to funds. The other opened a safety deposit box. Together they made the work of governance possible because they required multiple hands to move them. To carry them felt like bearing a continuing obligation. "He touched you like no one else," a friend once said, summarizing the headline. I carry the phrase with me, and I carry with it resistance. The word touched is too simple for what actually occurred. It suggests a moment and a physicality. What occurred was more like an architecture of influence that wrapped itself around lives and thought it could edit them without public consequence. That architecture, when it was forced into public view, compelled a different form of labor, the labor of repair. I do not pretend that repair is complete. It is a project that will require sustained attention and the humility to admit new missteps. It is the kind of work that does not make for simple news cycles because it is granular and slow. It is also work people can do, offering counseling, structuring boards to include survivors, funding legal clinics, ensuring that any future private interventions are subject to audit. As I stood at the curb, a man walked past holding an umbrella like a parcel and did not look twice. The city went on forgiving with its habitual legerdemain. The light caught the right surfaces. People carried on. But the ledger remained open on my desk, and the keys remained heavy in my pocket. If you have listened this far, if you find yourself drawn to stories where closeness and power collide, and where accountability is attempted rather than declaimed, consider subscribing for more. There are more chapters to tell. The long hearings, the negotiations that make policy, the small human reconciliations that never make headlines. For now, the foundation exists, the ledger records what it must, and I keep the keys as both burden and promise. He touched a socialite like no one else did, not by possessive drape but by the architecture of his will. His greatest sin was to mistake that will for a substitute of law. The rest of us have been left to do the daily, laborious work of translating that private power into public constraint, and to attempt repair where erasure once seemed easier. I walked into the rain with the keys in my hand. The metal was cool and honest. The ledger closed that night only in the way a book closes on a page, not finished, but saved for the next reading. I pocketed the keys and stepped back into the city, aware that the work would go on, that accountability is a practice, not an event, and that the only thing more important than exposing a ledger is insisting, day after day, that it be used to repair.